The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $265 on a clear, cold March morning in 2007 at the Bromley Limestone Quarry surplus sale outside Strong City, Kansas, and the heavy man in the dust-yellow Caterpillar ball cap, leaning against the chain link, let out a deep, snorted laugh that turned the heads of every Flint Hills cattle hand and quarry driver in the bidders line. Davenport Bromley, known across Chase and Riley counties as Dav, was 53, 6'1", and 300 pounds of quarry-broken bulk, a thick reddish-gray mustache, and a short reddish-gray beard, clipped close around a broad, weather-burned face, sharp pale blue eyes pouched in heavy weather tan, a chipped front tooth. He wore a heavy, oily denim mechanic's coverall buttoned at the chest under a stained tan canvas quarry vest, with two front pockets bulging with dolomite chip samples, knee-high, steel-toed quarry boots covered in pale limestone dust, a thick brown leather belt with a brass-stamped buckle showing the Bromley Quarry shield, and a dust-yellow Caterpillar ball cap pulled low over his eyes. A brass-handled steel dipstick and a small-chained dolomite sample mallet hung from clips on his belt at the right hip. He had owned Bromley limestone quarries in the Flint Hills for 21 years, and the surplus sale had been called for the back lot of the Strong City Quarry Yard. The 1959 REOF-22 wrecker at the back of the sale list had been the only piece left from a small independent recovery operator who had been a Bromley contract recovery man for 16 years until a high wall came down on him. Dav had told the auctioneer privately he would have hauled the REO down to the limestone crusher and dropped it into the rock pile for $50 cash. The 24-year-old shop mechanic at the back of the bidders line, in the deeply faded duck canvas work coat, had just outbid Dav for $265 against his casual $50 opening shot, and Dav was making sure the Flint Hills cattle hands understood the joke. Conrad Brenneman folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and walked through the limestone dust gravel to the truck. The REO F-22 was 22 feet of long-nose conventional cab heavy iron, the cab painted a faded REO cardinal red oxidized to a chalky brick rose along the body panels and limestone bleached bone white along the upper edges of the doors. The chrome REO script badge across the front of the long hood, tarnished to a dull pewter, both round chrome side cab mirrors snapped off at the brackets. The original Holmes 750 wrecker boom, with a hand-cranked twin-drum winch mounted on the rear deck listing 2 degrees right, with both cables frayed, the wooden cargo deck planks rotted through, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking dolomite gray block letters across the driver's door. The heavy box-section steel frame rails ran along both sides of the chassis beneath the cargo deck. Conrad had grown up 6 miles east of where this truck had last been parked, on a small blue-stem grass-fed cattle ranch outside Council Grove. His grandfather, Otto Brenneman, was waiting at the trailer. Otto was 78, a retired Flint Hills limestone quarryman who had worked the Cottonwood Falls and Strong City quarries for 41 years, between 1948 and 1989, 5'9", lean and erect, with broad bony shoulders and a slight stoop, snow-white hair clipped close, a thick white mustache, deep watery hazel eyes, in a face lined by Kansas wind, large knotted hands. Wire-rim half-glasses on a leather cord hung around his neck. A stubby clay tavern pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a heavy beige canvas chore coat, buttoned to the throat over a faded blue chambray work shirt, faded dark blue dungarees held up with thick brown leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather lace-up work boots covered in pale limestone dust, and a stained tan canvas quarry vest with the small chip rock sample pockets sewn across the chest. Otto set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted bumper of the REO and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Wallace Kessler's old F-22. Wallace Kessler had run Kessler Flint Hills Recovery out of a concrete block shop on Highway 177 outside Cottonwood Falls from 1973 until the high wall, working the steep limestone benches and the muddy spring quarry haul roads, pulling stuck Bromley haul trucks off the back grades and overturned cattle haulers out of the wet Kansas spring switchbacks. He had built the home's 750 wrecker boom himself onto the REO's rear deck in 1975 with the help of two welders from the Bromley Strong City Quarry Maintenance Shop on a long March weekend. He had married a Council Grove girl named Verity Vance in 1969, and they had a daughter, Bryony, born in 1976. Wallace had died in March of 1989. He had been rigging a recovery on a stuck Caterpillar 769 haul truck at the bottom of a Bromley Strong City quarry working face when a 6-ton limestone block on the unstable high wall 15 feet above the truck broke loose and fell. He had died at the scene of a broken back. He was 44. Bryony was 13. The REO had been recovered up out of the quarry by another wrecker out of Manhattan and parked behind the Kessler shop on Highway 177. Verity had paid the property tax for 15 years until she remarried in 2004 and moved to Topeka. The lot was let go to Chase County in 2006, and the inventory handed to Bromley for disposal under the long-standing quarry contract. The REO sat in the back of the Bromley Strong City yard for a year until the surplus sale. Conrad had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a Council Grove cattle hauler that Wallace Kessler's truck was finally being sold. They winched the F-22 onto Conrad's borrowed gooseneck trailer. Dav leaned on the chain link in his quarry vest, the brass-handled dipstick swinging from his belt clip, and as Conrad pulled out, he called across the limestone gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, Bromley Quarries would drop the REO into the rock pile for $50. Conrad did not answer. Otto climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 14 miles east on Highway 177 to Otto's red cedar timber frame shop behind a small clapboard ranch house on the edge of the Flint Hills Blue Stem outside Council Grove. The dead REO rocking behind them on the dry pavement, the home's 750 booms pointing at the long pale Kansas sky like two crooked fingers. The restoration would take 17 years. Nobody knew that on the drive east. Conrad worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Manhattan during the week and drove 25 minutes south on Highway 177 to Otto's shop every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab because Otto insisted. The REO cab corners had rusted through from 40 Kansas winters, and they cut out the rotted steel and welded in fresh 20-gauge sheet over a long weekend. They pulled the REO Gold Comet inline 6 gasoline engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Kansas winter went into the engine and into stories about Wallace Kessler. Otto told Conrad about the night in 1979 when Wallace pulled a stuck Council Grove cattle hauler out of a Cottonwood Creek at -7 and refused payment, except for a side of grass-fed beef. He told Conrad about the morning in 1984 when Wallace hauled a snapped D8 out of a Bromley rockfall and let the contractor pay him in 3 tons of crushed Flint Hills limestone. He told stories about Verity Kessler's bourbon pecan pie. The second year, they sand-blasted the limestone-bleached frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Otto slowed. He had a small heart attack in February and was in the Manhattan Mercy Regional Hospital for 8 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hands still worked. He told Conrad the truck would wait. By the 9th year, the F-22 was a roller. In the 11th year, Conrad's son was born, and the work paused for a month. By the 13th year, Otto sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding chair beside the wood stove, the half-glasses on the cord, the clay pipe between his teeth, pointing at what to do next. Through all those years, Dav drove past the foot of Otto's drive on the Highway 177 in his dust-yellow Bromley Quarries Ford F450 with the Bromley Shield decal on the side door, the dust-yellow Caterpillar cap visible through the open window. The F450 always slowed at the bottom of the drive, but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the REO was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy REO cardinal red that matched a faded snapshot Otto had of the truck from 1976, and they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking dolomite-gray junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Conrad did not know why. He just left it. By the 16th year, the Holmes 750 booms were rebuilt with fresh aircraft-grade twin-drum cables. By the 17th year, the F-22 was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the boom mount for fresh anchor bolts. The boom mount was the last thing on the list, because Otto always said, you start with what makes the truck move, and you finish with what keeps the boom from tearing the bed off the frame. On a cool, clear morning of March the 8th of the 17th year, Conrad pulled into Otto's red cedar shop with a fresh set of grade 8 boom mount anchor bolts and an angle grinder. He was 41 years old. The dark brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his left forearm from a wire-feed welder in 2016 was a faint line. His hands had the thickness of a man who had spent a third of his life under hoods. Otto was 95. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the shopwood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees. The wire-rim half-glasses on the leather cord settled on his nose, the stubby clay tavern pipe between his teeth. Conrad unbolted the rear boom mount cradle off the right side box section steel frame rail and set the cradle on the workbench. He started to wire brush the outer web of the frame rail where the new grade 8 anchor bolts would seat, and he stopped. There was a small rectangular discoloration in the steel web of the frame rail beneath the boom mount footprint, where the steel had been cut and re-welded. The weld was hand-applied and beaded, slightly proud of the original web. Conrad set down the wire brush. He took the angle grinder fitted with a thin cut-off wheel and cut a careful, slow seam along the upper edge of the rectangle. The web panel hinged downward on the uncut lower edge under the cut. Inside the sealed hollow chamber of the box section frame rail, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed butcher paper bound with brown twine, was a small flat oilcloth bundle. He carried the bundle to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and cut the twine and unfolded the oilcloth 2 layers deep. Inside were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 115 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $2,300. There was a small brass bituminous limestone hardness gauge with a fine engraved Mohs scale along the brass face and the words Cottonwood Falls Limestone / Quarryman's Tool / 1925 stamped across the brass base above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 4 in a tan canvas barn coat sitting on a Flint Hills cattle gate with the long pale blue stem grass running away behind her. The date, August 1980, written on the back in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Conrad unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated March the 14th of 1989. It read, "To my Bryony, the cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 18 when the Flint Hills cannot hold her. The hardness gauge is your grandfather Augustus's. He carried it on the Cottonwood Falls quarry face from 1925 until he retired in 1962, and he gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1963. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather walked you out to the long blue stem to teach you how to stand still and listen to a meadowlark. I am welding these inside the frame rail under the boom mount because the high wall above the strong city working face has been showing fresh fractures every Monday for a month, and I do not want them lost if anything happens at the bottom of the quarry this spring. The truck is yours when you're old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Wallace Augustus Kessler, Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, March 14th, 1989. Conrad sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Otto held it in both hands at arm's length and read it once, through the half-glasses, and set it down. He said quietly, "Wallace wrote this 6 days before the limestone block came down off the high wall." The girl never knew. They drove east to Council Grove the next Saturday. Otto had called a Flint Hills cattle hauler whose niece worked the small Council Grove grass-fed cattle co-op office, and the niece had given them a current address for Bryony Kessler Vance on a small blue stem ranch outside Council Grove. They drove east on Highway 177 under a clear blue Kansas morning past long pale blue stem and pulled into a long gravel drive past white rail cattle fence, parking at a small clapboard ranch office with a hand-painted sign reading Kessler Vance Grass-Fed Beef. The woman who came out of the office wearing a tan canvas barn coat was 48 years old. She had Wallace Kessler's broad shoulders and her father's deep hazel eyes. She wore a tan canvas Carhartt-style barn coat open over a faded indigo cotton work shirt, faded dark blue dungarees, scuffed brown leather riding boots, a small silver meadowlark pendant on a thin silver chain at her throat, and a thin gold wedding band on her left ring finger. Otto spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his REO in my shop in 1983. My grandson here bought the F-22 at the Bromley surplus sale over in Strong City 17 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded inside her frame rail that belongs to you." Bryony's face changed. She brought them into a small ranch office kitchen, and they sat at a round oak table, and Conrad set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the hardness gauge, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Bryony picked up the brass hardness gauge. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving on the brass base. She said her grandfather Augustus had worked the Cottonwood Falls quarry from 1925 until 1962, that the family had been told the gauge had been sold to a Topeka dealer in 1965, and that she had been looking for it for 30 years. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to Otto's Red Cedar shop the next morning. Bryony stood in the open bay and walked slowly around the REO 3 times. She ran her hand along the chrome REO script badge across the long hood. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking dolomite-gray junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Conrad and she asked the price. Conrad looked at his grandfather. Otto laid both hands on the arms of the wooden chair and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone. And then we are going to drive her down a Highway 177 to Cottonwood Falls and park her at the empty concrete block lot where Kessler Flint Hills Recovery stood until March of 1989. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1973. The boy paid $265 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing, but the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the REO through that summer. Bryony drove up from Council Grove every other Sunday. On the morning of October the 4th of the 18th year, they rolled the F-22 out of Otto's shop under a clear blue Kansas sky and drove her in convoy south on Highway 177 to Cottonwood Falls and parked her facing the empty concrete block lot where Kessler Flint Hills Recovery had stood until March of 1989. Conrad handed Bryony a small can of deep cardinal red paint and a 1-inch brush. Bryony climbed up on the running board and she painted out the flaking dolomite-gray junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Kessler, Flint Hills Recovery, established 1973. Old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A dust-yellow Bromley Quarries Ford F450 went by on Highway 177. Dav Bromley was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the REO at the empty concrete block lot with the cardinal red door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not snort. He drove on. The REO sits on Highway 177 in Cottonwood Falls today, and the sign on the door reads, Kessler Flint Hills, Recovery established 1973. Bryony runs the grass-fed beef ranch outside Council Grove. The $2,300 sits in a small lockbox at her ranch office. The 1925 Cottonwood Falls hardness gauge sits beside it. The 1980 photograph is framed above her kitchen table. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year, on the 14th of March. If you ever see an old REOF 22 parked along Highway 177 in Cottonwood Falls with the words Kessler Flint Hills Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down. Roll the window down and listen. There is a story in that truck that a quarry boss in a dust-yellow Caterpillar cap would have dropped into the rock pile for $50, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.